All right, let's go ahead and get started, everybody. Welcome back to our final day of this ArchivesSpace Basics training. We are going to do a homework recap really quickly. We did get a good number of questions through the feedback form. We're going to get to as many as we can, but at 12:30 my time, so a half hour after the hour, we're going to cut off questions and move on to the content for the day. And then at the final wrap up, we'll catch up on any questions that we weren't able to answer during this homework recap. But we are going to go ahead and dive into those questions first. One of the questions that we got, and just so everyone knows, there's a question of how long will your test instances be available to you? You should have those through the end of the week. After that, if you still want to practice or want access to an ArchivesSpace instance that isn't the one that you use at your organization, or maybe you don't have access to one at your organization, you can do that by accessing our sandbox. And there's information on how to access the sandbox on our Getting Started page, which is one of the post-workshop resources linked on your agenda. So, or you can just go to our website and look at our Getting Started page. And the sandbox is there available. It's an open play space. You can do whatever you want in there. There's no test data. You would need to create that yourself, but it is a test instance that's available to anyone. Just as a reminder, also in your post-workshop resources, there is a link to a workshop evaluation. I'll remind you again at the end, but please do fill that out. This will really help us as we continue to plan and prep and provide these online workshops. This is the first one we've done at this scale with this large of a group. So your feedback would really be appreciated. All right, so we're going to dive into our other questions for the day. We're going to answer all of the questions related to digital objects first, so get ready. All right, so first question we got, for the simple digital object exercise, could you clarify how to create a file version for the master TIFF? No, we just took over. Without having the URI to that file.
Yeah, I think I can sort of explain that. That could be both just a poorly framed homework question, but if you want to add a file version for a master TIFF, I'm assuming you all can see my screen. I'm just going to browse to one of these digital objects that already exists. This one is from that Krispy Kreme collection that we were looking at. This one has, right now, it has one file version for this image service. If we wanted to create another one, we can just click add file version or click that plus button as I did. And then what you'd want to do is under use statement, you just want to clarify that this is the image master. And then if you want to note that it's a TIFF file, you could choose this tagged image file format. That's actually what the TIFF is an abbreviation for. And then as far as the question was related to the file URI, ideally you have a URI, a link that's resolvable, but that's not a requirement. So if you could imagine a scenario where like maybe you don't really expose those TIFF files publicly on the web, like maybe they're just saved somewhere on local storage, it's perfectly acceptable to, you know, put a file path to those master files wherever they exist on your system, if that's going to be useful for you in like finding them. So it doesn't have to be a URI. It can be like a file path or some other location. So you could have something like, you know, my TIFF files directory or something on your F drive. And that would be perfectly fine. Hope that sort of makes sense.
Thanks, Noah. All right, the next digital objects question that we got. The complex digital objects instructions mention constant data. Is using RDE the best way to apply that information to multiple objects, or is there another way?
Yeah, that's a good question. I'm not exactly sure what they mean by constant data, but there are a couple of ways you could sort of expedite filling out fields for a complex digital object. And one of them is definitely using RDE, like we looked at last week, where you could set up your template your RDE template and kind of pre-populate certain fields with certain values. What it might be, what I think the workbook is referring to, though, is something we're actually going to see a little bit later today. And that's a way that you can set up default values for each of the different record types. And I'll just give you a teaser of this real quick. But if I were to go to digital object, browse digital objects, there's a little button here on the browse menu that says edit default values. And so for either digital objects or digital object components, you can sort of bring up what looks like a brand new record. But what this actually is, it's a template. I guess you could call this constant data. But if I filled out, whoops, if I filled out, for example, certain information in the file version and I saved this, what I'm actually doing is saving a template. So I'll just put some junk data in here for the sake of showing how this works. So I saved this component default values. And now when I go to create a new digital object and I go to create a new file version, there's one other thing that I have to set, but I will explain this later. Now if I go to create a digital object, oh, it's not working. Oh, we're dealing with complex digital objects here. So let's save this. Just trying to make sure I have all the required data. So now if I were to add a component, a child component of this digital object, you can see here, because I had set this value and I had clicked publish in my template record, it applies the default values from that template to any new child component I create. Hopefully that makes sense. I'll show an example of how this works in resource records in just a little bit, and it'll make more sense. I don't want to take too much of our time on it right now.
Thanks, Noah. Yeah, he'll show
Sure.
how to do it again later. And then finally, can you show how to add a thumbnail again?
Yeah, let's just look at the digital object that we created on Tuesday again, that Krispy Kreme at nightfall example. So if we remember, this one had two file versions. It had one that was sort of a link to the page in Flickr, and it had another second file version that refers to the thumbnail. And so just to review kind of how you would structure this, the URI in this case links directly to a JPEG thumbnail version of this image. We've said that this is a thumbnail. And then I think the most important thing here is that you, in this show attribute dropdown, you choose embed. And that kind of instructs the ArchivesSpace public interface to embed this thumbnail on the page. And again, you have to make sure that you have the publish checkbox checked. But this should work. So if we viewed this published version, we see the thumbnail.
All right. Thanks. Those are all of the digital object questions. We're going to move on to other questions, and I think Nancy's going to tackle the rest of these. So Nancy, I hope you're ready. In terms of subject headings, how important is it to include a value in the optional authority ID field? Nancy, you're muted if you're speaking. Nancy? Nancy, you're muted, right?
Yeah, Nancy.
Okay, Nancy.
Hold on.
There we go. Okay.
Okay, yeah.
There we go. I didn't realize you couldn't unmute me, and we muted me earlier. Sorry about that. So I think the question is really, is it important to you to use that authority ID? Do you have a purpose for wanting to track that that's where it came from? Do you want to go in and run a report that pulls them out and then associates them with a different display system or something? One of the challenges with using the ID is that in the case of bacteria here, the ID only ever applies to the first part of a term. So if this is subfielded, the ID applies equally only to the first term. So if I use it in both, you can't save the second record because it wants the ID to be unique. If you felt strongly about it, what you could do is, and I went and I looked this up a minute ago, so the actual LCSH ID for this term is this, and I could save that. But I cannot then use it with any of the other headings that happen to use this term. So you could have a base term in the system with the ID associated with it, but that won't help you with the others. And again, it has to be unique. So that's a bit of a challenge with using the ID in the subjects module at this point. And again, if you wanted to, it might have to be, again, having that base term and then assigning it to that. But that might be a lot more work than it's worth, depending on what your need for it is. But again, any of these that you look at, this does not have an asterisk by it. It is not required in the system. It's there if you want to use it, but be aware there are some, again, limitations with its use. So I think that's that question. Although Noah and Jessica, feel free to chime in.
Thanks, Sam. All right. Next question. How can I find out what standards each of the drop-down menus are built using? For example, do the agent records use the MARC relator codes? Are the instance types based on a metadata schema? Where can I find this information for myself as a non-member?
So some of these are actually shown. I know it's going to go into the system, I think, a little bit more later today, but just to preview, in the list of controlled value lists, some of the actual list titles will include whether or not it's an ISO standard. With many of the others, they're actually coming from EAD and the requirements there. So for example, the archival record level, it doesn't say here where it's coming from. If you click on it and view it, it's not a configurable list. You can't add fields to this. But again, I believe this is coming from EAD and probably other archival standards. Talking about this before we started, we don't know of an overall comprehensive list that shows where each of the non-configurable dropdowns or the controlled by standards lists are sort of put together. We were guessing that if one went back, and this should be available to anybody, looked at the original ArchivesSpace specifications, that might well point to where some of these lists were taken from. I think Jessica was going to try and throw a note in the chat with a link to some of these places at some point. So, it kind of raised the question for us. There's not a good summary out there and easily accessible of exactly where they come from. But again, most of them are going to come from standards or from the EAD specification itself. So I hope that answers. I'm sorry, it's not the ideal answer you might like, but I think that's the best I know of. And again, feel free to chime in, other folks.
Those the person asked about the relator codes. That's an example. Those definitely are drawn from the MARC relator codes, list. One thing to point out though, and this applies to languages too, is that ArchivesSpace just sort of holds a snapshot of those controlled vocabularies. They're not in any way synced to the actual MARC list or to the ISO standards. So I know there's some examples of where there have been additional language codes added to the ISO lists that don't exist in ArchivesSpace.
Yeah, thanks y'all. I went ahead and I dropped a link to all of our technical documentation, just because that was easiest, that Nancy mentioned there. So all of our technical documentation, including that foundational documentation, is available on our website. You don't have to be a member to access that. All right, last question. We did a good job getting through these questions. Can you explain when to use the child type and indicator fields when creating a container profile? If you're entering that information in a folder list, using either RD or import, why would I need to indicate the child type indicator in the instance?
Okay, so I think rather than using container profile, I think the question actually refers to creating top containers. Whoever's question it was, chime in on the chat if I'm wrong about that. I think we're talking about top containers. So I'm going to come over to a resource that actually is more fleshed out. And when you're creating a let me drill down to an instance. When you're creating a top container, so in this case, correspondence, regardless of whether you're creating that container in a RDE instance or if you're doing it here directly, what you're doing is creating that outermost. So if an occasion you have, and you don't always need to do type and indicator. So if, for example, the container, the thing you're going to pull from your stacks and present in the reading room is just a single oversized flat file, that might simply be the container, and you don't need a child unless you're saying it's item 10 in that particular oversized flat file. If you're creating it as a box and you want to track the folders, the actual, like it's folder 1 through 5 in the box, then you would need to use the child type and indicator, because the top container would simply refer to the box. The child would refer to the stuff, the subcontainers within the box, which would be the folders. Now, if you're not tracking to folders within a box, again, you don't have to record that. There's no point. There's nothing to record. But if you're doing folders, then that's where you would do it. So it depends on, again, what that outermost container is. So in this case, they wanted to call out that there was this specific intellectual content that's described here. I don't know why in this is actually contained within folder 10 that is stored within box 1. If you wanted to get more specific, you could clearly add the grandchild and say it's items or something if you needed to. So if you're creating it in rapid data entry, you're going to go to create that top container screen. And that's just for the just for the outermost container, not for any specificity you want to include within it. Does that help?
Thanks, Nancy. There's nothing in the chat, but if anyone has any follow-up questions about that, please feel free to pop those into the Q&A now. That was the last of the feedback form questions that we got before we started today, which is great. We actually managed to make it through. We were worried about time. So I'm going to just pause here to see if any other questions pop up through the Q&A before you get started on locations, Nancy. So please type your questions now. But I know we could also very much use any extra time to talk about locations. So I think this is okay. All right, I'm not seeing anything in the chat. So Nancy, if you're ready to move on, I think we're ready to move on.
Okay, if any pop in, just feel free to interrupt me. And I will stay unmuted, so that will be helpful. Okay, so we are going to talk about, in a way this segues fairly well, because we were just discussing top containers. What we're about to discuss now is, I was just saying that the things that you want to pull from your stacks or vaults to present in a reading room. So we have these boxes, we have these older size folders. The older size folders, for example, might live in whatever you might call them, might be map drawers, might be flat file drawers. There's a variety of nomenclature that's used. Your boxes could be sitting on ranges and columns and shelves. They might be sitting on aisles and columns and no shelves. You might have an oversized, framed item that's hanging on a wall someplace. What we're about to talk about is how you can track where all of this collection material, where these containers and these objects are sitting and can be found if you needed to pull them for some reason. So that's what we're going to talk about now. And so what we're again referencing here is physical material. So to put it in the most basic of terms, if you can pick it up and throw it, the locations we're about to talk about are the places where it lands. I can use locations, for example, to track the location of a server. I cannot use them to track the locations of files on that server. That's where we're going back to that URI that would appear in a digital object. That's, in a sense, its location to roughly, speaking roughly. So just to start, if you are depending on your permission levels, you may or may not be able to create locations. You can all do it now because we're in here as administrators. There is a permission setting that when you just start the system only comes checked as a default at the repository manager level. So if you're in here as just creating data, you may not see the ability to create locations. In part, that's intentional because when you're building them out, you probably want to do it across your buildings. And you want to do it, sort of sit down with everyone who's going to be involved in pulling stuff and make sure that you have consistent nomenclature so that when you eventually dump out a shelf list, you're creating all of your locations in a fairly standard way so that things will sort together when they come out. You probably don't want to create a lot of one-offs if you need them. A one-off location might be somebody moves to a different office, and so you need to reflect that something is stored in this new place. But for most of your stack areas, you're probably going to want to build them out with the entire room at once, and then it's done consistently. And so the idea is that this shouldn't be just anybody in there messing about with these all of the time. So let's move on. So here's where you would actually do it. There are a couple options as before. Locations, you can create a single location or batch. We're going to do both. You could also do it through the browse screen. And in this case, if I look at it, we don't have any in the system. So that's what that looks like. But even here, you can again see the options to create a location or create batches. And we'll get to edit batch in just a little bit. So I'm going to build just an initial location and show the fields. And I'm just going to show the core basics here. So the required fields, you have to have some kind of indicator for the building, at least. And you either have to have a barcode for that location, some sort of classification scheme for it, or coordinate labels and indicators. Now, as was the case with top containers, where for the most part, a top container and a child are going to be a box and a folder, but there's such a variety of possible uses that using those names as labels would have been a hindrance to other uses. And the same thing with resources, that it's for the most part finding aids, but might also reflect other kinds of description, whether it's for individual theses and dissertations, because there are use cases for that. Coordinate was chosen as a very generic term, so that if your coordinates in your stacks were, say, range 1, column, so range 1, and this again is hierarchical, so it might be range 1, column 14, shelf 26. It could be aisle 10, column something, or sometimes it's section. It might be aisle 10, section 14. So again, it was meant to, the label was meant to be something that you fill in for whatever you call the widest part of your stack section. And it might be, watch capitalization, column go back in and fill in. I just should not be allowed to type. SPE. See, I shouldn't be allowed to do it publicly. So we could do this. You could say, if you wanted to get more specific, it's on floor 4, 3, what I just said about the typing, and room 111. So this might be an area of compact shelving. If you had a location profile, if you said all of these shelves were of a certain size, you could assign it here at this point. You can also assign that later. I'll show you how. And if you want to associate this area or this with a specific repository in a multi-pod repository environment, you can do it here. I can then save this location. And if I save the location, then it will simply save the record. And then I have to go back into the browse screen or wherever if I want to make a second location to make a second. If I hit the +1, it will save this record and open a new record. And it should have preserved some of this so I could go ahead and make a second location using some of the existing information. So I'm going to hit the +1. And so it made it one location. If I now go back, I'm not going to move away from this just yet. It saved it. It brought back in this top level. I could then say, so maybe this time, and don't do this in real life, this is as an example, aisle 22. When I say don't do this in real life, I'm using very different terms. You want to be consistent about that within your own repository. Section 3. And I could save that. If I go back to location, I now have 2 different locations in here. So that's how you would create a single one. Another scenario for a single one, for example, would be, I might say, library or floor room. Even say something like office. So if I were processing something in my office, I could relocate a box to a book truck in my office or my desk or something like that. So this is why you might build out singles. So let's go back, and I'm going to show you this once more just to reiterate this coordinate label business, because we're going to build out a few batch locations. So if I had to build out in my vaults a location for every single shelf, I would be here until the end of time. So I don't want to do that. I want to create these in batch. So what we're going to do is when we do this, you will see that this top level stays the same, but this is going to become a chart. And I'm actually going to share briefly just a little PowerPoint one of our other trainers put together that is pretty useful in terms of visuals. So this, again, might be in your vaults, a area of shelving. So it might be something like range or row 12, column 1, and then shelf 3 in particular. The other way, what we're about to show you is how you do this in batch. So when I pull this up in a second, we'll enter some in. These coordinate ranges that you saw before just as singletons are now going to be sort of a chart. So this might be your row, it might be your range, it might be your aisle, whatever term you use. And then we're going to say for all of these rows, you can see this is a large room and it has 401 through 488. So and they're all sort of consistently sized. So we're going to ask it to start building out these rows, and we're going to a bunch of them. And how you number them is up to you. So 488 here, for example, some places might say one side is 487, and this might be what they're doing. One side is 487, one side is 488. Other places might say this entire block of shelving is 488, and columns 1 through 5 are on, it's columns 1 through 10, 5 on one side and the next 5 or 6 through 10 on the other. Or it could be, as I said, the 488 could be just columns 1 through 5 down one side. Other people will track it by the aisle, the open space between. And so down one side of the aisle might be columns 1 through 5, and up the other side might be columns 6 through 10. We haven't really found a scenario that this can't handle. So here's how the rows would look. And then you might say, here's your columns. So for each of these rows, 401 through 488, they're going to have, all of them have a column A and a column B. They probably have a C, D, and E as well. So again, as long as it's all consistent, it's very easy to use this. So the next range in this case might be shelf. Each row has several columns on it. Each column has 6 shelves. So if the columns were A through E, 1 to, across, and then each of them have 6 shelves, then at this point, if we create them, we're creating a massive range of locations down to the shelf all at once. So let me skip back over to ArchivesSpace and I'll do that. So I'm going to come up and I'm going to go, this time I'll do it through here. We're going to do create batch locations. And so, and again, this will give you a little bit of a help. This is the base values. So I'm going to say special library. Maybe this is floor 2, room 100. I could add this if I had it. I'm not going to right now. And so all of the stuff that I build out down in these ranges will have the information here associated with it. So I don't have to repeat that all the time. This is seen as fairly fixed. This is, I'm building out this particular area. So again, the word range here is used far too often. But so let's say our label is again sort of the word, so stack. And I'm going to use column. You could use section. Again, there are a variety of things you can call them. And shelf. I could do prefixes. If my stacks were, one stack 100 and one side was A and one side was B, I could use this prefix to say, or a suffix to say 100A, and then I could build out a chunk for 100A. I could go back later, build out a chunk for 100B. So let's say my ranges are stacks of 0, 1. Leading zeros come in handy to get them to sort the way you would actually like them to. And it might be 10. So these are the number of blocks of compact shelving that I want to track, for example. I could then say each stack has 5 columns. So each stack will have a column 1 through a column 5. On each column is going to have shelves. And so every column will have a shelf number 1 and a shelf through shelf number 6. And if I wanted, again, say A or B, like could be stack 1A, I could say that here. You can then preview these locations to see what the system is about to build. This is a good idea to make sure that you've spelled things correctly, because I'll show you how to batch edit things. I'll show you some of the limitations on batch editing things in a moment. So I'm going to do preview, and this is what it's about to build for you. I'm building 300 locations all at once. It's my very special library. It's not putting the field labels, but it's floor 2, room 100, stack column, and here's shelf 1, 2, 4, 5, 6, column 2, shelf 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And as I scroll down, here's stack 10, column 5, shelf 6. If I hit continue, because I like it, let's say, and I hit create locations, it's now built 300. Now you're only seeing, this is going to take it a minute to refresh, I think. There we are. So now we have 303. because I built 3 singletons earlier, and I just built another 300. Over on the side, you can sort and filter by floor and room, and some of the other fields at the top. So let's, and once now that we've populated the browse area, you'll see some of these fields are filled in, and you can sort. So you can sort based on location, building, floor, room, area. What this is also showing you is 10 records at a time. There's a config file on the server side that you could have your database administrator set to say show 50 records at a time. Now, let's say I made a mistake in my spelling, which given my typing never happens. But let's just say for the heck of it that I did, and I want to go in and I need to edit some of these because I didn't catch it before I created them. You can select everything on the page to edit by clicking at the box at the top. This does not carry over to other pages, however. So if I want to select everything on pages 1 and 2, I go over, I can click this, and now I've got page 2, but if I click back, page 1 has unselected. So you can select a batch to edit, but you can only select things on any one page. So if you're displaying 50, you could edit 50 at a time. In this case, I'm showing 10. I can only edit 10 at a time. If I had 1,000 records in here and needed to fix the spelling on all of them, it would take me a little while. So that's why there's that location preview when you're creating batches to make sure that you're doing what you want to do. You can edit these, but it is time consuming. And when you edit them, I'm going to hit edit batch, and it will bulk update them. The only things you can fix are this top level information. So if I had misspelled it, what it will do, if you type in one of these, it doesn't show you the data that already exists. What you're typing in is the data that will replace anything that currently exists in that field. So if my building before was very special library, even though that was very consistent about that, you don't see it here. By typing in nice library, I will overwrite that for the records that appear on the left. So if I do that, that's what it did. I now have 2 different buildings to sort between. So if I misspell stack, I'm out of luck. I can't edit it that way. I'd have to go in and edit this location individually to fix that, which you can do, but that's one by one. So again, watch the whole batch creation and make sure you're doing and using the labels and spelling them in the way that you want to. And I don't think I used leading indicators or leading zeros there, and I probably should have. So that was probably a mistake. It behaves better with leading zeros. So we built these locations, but at this point, like many of the other parts of the system, these are siloed. They're not actually associated with anything yet. So there are a couple ways of associating a top container. Actually, let me build out one more just so I have it here as an example. I'm going to build out one other batch for a different type of location. So let's say for and this time I'm going to say that case and drawer. And so I might have stacks of flat file drawers. And so this might be, map case 1. It might be a stack of several cases on top of each other. So I have through 5. And each case, each stack of cases might have 20 drawers. So I would have, I'm not going to make this mistake again. 20. I'm going to preview that. Let's continue. Maybe I want to do this instead. So now I have some flat file drawers made. So let's say I now want to assign these to actual associate boxes with these locations. What I'm going to do, there are a couple ways of doing it, and you can really do this with accessions. So if you have top containers and boxes associated with your accession records, you can do it there, and you can do it with resources. There's not really a way to do it with digital objects, because again, digital objects are that the locations for that are really handled more through the file version. That's where you find it. So in this case, I'm going to go to resources. I'm going to go to my, let's say something I was playing with that probably has them on company governance records. I'm going to edit that. Got my board records, meeting materials, minutes, and I've got box 20, folder 2 through 5. And if I scroll down to the instances, if I hover over the top container while it's blue and left click, so hover over and left click, you'll get view. You can actually open up just that container record and edit it to add the location. And I could say that this is in so stack 10, maybe shelf 2. And that's where this particular box lives. And save the container. So that's one way of doing it. You can also browse to, well, you can't do it there. So you can do it from here. The other place you can do it, and this is partly why I love this particular part of the system, manage top containers. And again, I went over here to the gearbox, to the drop down, and manage top containers. And I can now look up all of the boxes that are associated with, or all of the containers that are associated with either an individual resource, an individual accession, that are already stored at a given location, that are of a particular size, or that are associated with archival objects or resources that contain a given keyword. You can also do a search for all the boxes that either are or are not associated with a location at all. So I'm going to pull up my Krispy Kreme corporation records and search for that. And here are all of the boxes. And note there's a place for location, but they aren't assigned yet. So I'm going to sort them in indicator order. I'm going to grab the first 6, and I'm going to go to bulk operations. I'm going to put them at single location. I'm going to say library. They're all going to be on shelf 2, stack 1, column 1. Update 6. Continue. And it'll take, in a minute, I will refresh it. Notice that after I have done this, these stay selected. You actually have to actively unselect them. So if I were to not remember they were selected, come down here, do some more. Oops, sorry. Do some more. There's also bulk operations at the bottom. Update locations. Now it's telling me I'm doing 9. Now wait a minute, I didn't want to do 9. So you have to, especially if you're on a very long list, you have to kind of remember to select and unselect to clear out the boxes you had just moved, if that makes sense. You could also, and I'm gonna search, and now they're showing up. I had to give it a minute to come back. Now they're showing up at that location. I could I think there's an oversize. This is considered, I think this is an oversized box in the system. So I could select single location, and I could say drawer 6. So this is a much faster way of getting them into the system. And the locations and the top containers tied together and used within the system. So are there questions about this at this point?
There was one question in the Q&A that Noah did answer, but I think it's worth addressing. When you're creating locations, specifically batch locations, does it understand alpha ranges like ABC or only numeric indicators like 1, 2, 3? So Noah answered that yes, it does. It understands both alpha ranges and numeric ranges, and will apply those sequentially. But if you use some combination like 1A, 1B, 1C, it can't parse that.
Yeah, if you want to use those prefixes, for example, prefixes or suffixes, let me go back and I'll show you create locations, batches. So it might be range column. And this is 1 through 3, 1 through 6. So if you did an A, what it would look like would be preview locations, range 1A, column 1. And then if you have to build these, so I'm going to say continue, create locations, and create a batch. And do 1 through 3 and 1 through 6B. And then preview. So this would create your other side. You just do them in order. Just find all the things that are common, build them out in chunks that way. And then if I went, so in this, if you use the prefix, it will know that 1A and 1B follow each other. And then 2A and 2B follow each other, but you have to use that prefix or suffix in order for the system to understand that. If you just type 2A in there, it won't really know what to do.
Thanks, Nancy. And can you talk a little bit about what the temporary field is used for?
This is something in the past I haven't had a great deal of luck with, honestly. But so if I go back to, I'm just going to open this location. If you click temporary, it opens up this drop-down menu to say something's in this particular location is reading room, loan, exhibit. This is a configurable list you could add to it. Don't think it has any particular functionality in terms of when you assign it to a box. It just notes that this is a temporary location that it is in. So if say reading room, actually, I'm going to change. Let me do something a little differently to give you a better idea. I'm going to go back to my book truck. I'm going to actually edit this to say it's just in my office. And I'm going to say this is temporary. And it could be for, I could add a field here for processing. I'm just going to say reading room right now. And if I save this, I could then go over, let's say my Krispy Kreme records, manage top containers, search. I could say this particular box lives here. I can edit it. I could actually add a second location and say office, I could add a note just to reiterate, to reinforce something if I wanted to. I could save the container. Search again, might take it a minute to come up. Yeah, we'll give it a second for the indexing to happen. There we go. So you can see this one has two locations. One actually shows where its home in the stacks is. This one says it's here in my office. Here it does not say temporarily. But if I review it, so that temp is sort of a signal for the location. You know, it doesn't really show up here. But if you're running reports or something and you want to trigger on a temporary location, then that's where you could pull that data out. But you don't really see it here. But it did give me the opportunity to show you how to assign a box to two locations. Not that I would normally recommend doing that, but in-house we use that to preserve. We don't overwrite the permanent location. We might add a second one to indicate that it's temporarily someplace else, so we know where to reshelve it. But that's the one scenario I've really come up with for why you'd want two containers associated, or two locations associated with the same container.
Would temporary location be used to track a loan for another institution's exhibition?
You could. You could also use it. I think I've used it for, I created one for like a reformatting. And so I created a location for my reformatting vendor. Because we have several. And so I might have a temporary location like out for reformatting, and then say which vendor it's with.
What do you mean when you say you haven't had much luck with temporary locations? Do you use?
Well, in past, I think there were some, in past versions of ASpace, sometimes it didn't always, work terribly well or function. I think it functions now, but even now, selecting it doesn't gain me much in my practical day-to-day use of ASpace. It's something I can, trigger a report on. But as I just showed you here, you can't tell. I happen to know that my office is the temporary location, but it's not telling you that information. So I think in part, it depends on what you're hoping to get out of it. If I had made this non-temporary, it wouldn't at this point make any difference in the day-to-day functionality that you're seeing through the staff interface, as far as I've been able to determine. So I don't know what version 3 is going to do. These things always evolve. So
I think for this, nothing, but I might be wrong. So do you use Aon or another system to track your boxes moving around?
Oh, don't I wish. At home, no, we're not. But there are, actually, I might let Jessica speak more to this. I think there are some webinars out there and some discussions about integrations between Aon and ArchivesSpace.
There are, and I can drop that in the chat.
I'll just add that I don't think ArchivesSpace is really designed to support like circulation management or, tracking historical locations of materials moving around. There is the temporary location feature, but there's no great way to track like all of the times a box has been, served in the reading room. So we do use Aon separate from ArchivesSpace to track circulation. That's not, that's just one option. There could be other ways you track circulation, but it's not really baked into ArchivesSpace to be able to do that.
Yeah, that was right. I'm going to drop the link to the webinar on integration with Aon, but if you check out our webinars page, there's a couple other webinars related to other tools that people use for circulation and how they integrate with ArchivesSpace. You might want to check those out too.
And otherwise, if there are more questions, I'll hand it over to Noah just a few minutes early.
Yeah,
Just
good
a few.
Yeah. All right, Noah, are you ready?
Yeah. Hold
All
on
right.
1 second.
Okay, we're going to go ahead and talk about, oh, wait. We have one more question.
Okay.
Can you demonstrate batch adding multiple locations to some containers?
I can't add. I can't add multiple. You have to add locations to containers one at a time. I don't know of a way to say assign a container to multiple locations at once. Was that's how the question read or sounded to me? Was that misinterpreting? What was?
No, the other way is what they said.
So how to assign, so basically show you again how to assign multiple boxes to a given location.
Nancy, I think maybe what they're asking is that the batch feature in top containers where you can batch apply multiple locations. Yeah.
So if I select, oh yeah, I know what you're talking about. If I select, say, for example, these four.
You might want to share your screen again.
Oh, yep. Sorry, back. And I don't want to open that. Share screen. Okay, so let me go back. If I've selected, say, 4 boxes. And if I go to multiple locations, I could then assign each box to a different shelf. So stack 1, column 1, shelf 4, stack 1, column 1, shelf 2, stack 1, column 2, shelf 4, and shelf 6. So in this case, I've got 4 boxes. I'm assigning them to 4 separate locations. And in a second, I will refresh the screen. It might take it a second to come back.
Thanks, Nancy. That's what they wanted to see.
Okay, yep, there they are. That's it. All right, now I really will stop sharing and try and stay that way and give it to Noah.
All right, we're going to pass off to Noah to start talking about imports before we go to break. There is a question in the chat. Someone's asking about how people track how their records have been used by readers over time. I'm going to move that into the answered status. And if other people in the webinar or in the training want to maybe type their answer about how they track their use statistics, please feel free. It'd be great if we could get a little conversation going on that. So that is going to be in the Q&A, and please feel free to chime in via text. All right, Noah?
Great. You all see my screen?
We do.
Okay, good. So yeah, from now until break, we'll talk about all the different ways, or at least most of the ways that you can import data into ArchivesSpace. There are quite a few. There are actually a few new ones that since the last time I taught the workshop, but and then we'll do a demo of just like 1 or 2 imports just to see how they sort of function. But the primary way you go about importing data is from the background jobs area. So there are a couple different ways you can get there. From my home screen, if I click the create dropdown and then I go to the very bottom, I'll see this background jobs link. And then within background jobs, there is an option to import data. So if I click that, it's going to take me to this new background job page, import data. All imports aside, or actually all imports are, yeah, a form of background job. And this just means that whenever I, import a file into ArchivesSpace and start that job, it can kind of happen in the background. And then while it's running, I can move around in the application and it's not going to disrupt that import. This is just a nice way to, and it will also, as a background job, it will keep a log of all of the imports that you have run over, over time in your system. So what are all the ways you can import? Under import type here, we have a drop down, and here you can see most of the imports that ArchivesSpace supports. And we're not going to do a demo of all of these, but I thought what I would do is go through each one of these options and kind of briefly discuss what's going to happen, what would happen if you imported data in that format. And so all of these options, there are really sort of two broader types of imports. You can either import XML files that conform to different XML standards, or you can import different flavors of CSV files. So XML or CSV, those are really the two kind of data standards that ArchivesSpace can import. Within the XML kind of type, there are several options. There are three things you can do if you import Mark XML. And so Mark XML is really just an XML version of the Mark standard. This could be something that Mark XML could be something that you export from your integrated library system. There are also tools for sort of converting raw Mark files into Mark XML format. You can express Mark in a lot of different ways, and XML is just one particular way. But Mark XML is the only way that you can import a Mark record into ArchivesSpace. It must be in XML format. And we don't have time to go into sort of the specification for Mark XML, but you can find that, on the web, on the Library of Congress site. So what are the things you can do with Mark XML? You can import accession records. So this would be a way you could have an XML file with multiple records in it, and each record would import as a separate accession record. You can import a resource record from Mark XML. One thing to point out with resource records is that the Mark standard really only supports a single level description. And so when you import a resource record as Mark XML, you're only importing like top level collection information. You're not importing container lists or lower level description, just because you can't really do that in the Mark standard. When you import Mark XML as a resource record, it's going to both create your top level collection information, but it's also going to create any subject records or agent records that you have in that Mark file. You can also use Mark XML to import only subject and agent records. So if you don't want to create, resource, you just want to import subject and agents, you can use kind of the Mark Authority XML standard to load subject and agent records into ArchivesSpace. While we're on XML, we're talking about XML, there are two other XML formats that ArchivesSpace will import, and that is EAD, encoded archival description, or EAC, encoded archival context. In my experience, EAD is probably the most common import format for most folks. So we'll take a look at an example of importing an EAD file here in just a second. EAC is what, if you happen to have an EAC file laying around, this is a standard for encoding information about agents. It would create an agent record from that EAC file. And then finally, there are several different CSV formats you can import. locations. You can, in the same way that Nancy showed how you can batch create locations within the staff interface itself. If you wanted to provide a spreadsheet of location information, you could import all of those at once from a spreadsheet. You can do the same thing with digital objects, with assessment records, or with accessions. So essentially in all of these formats, every row in your CSV spreadsheet is going to become a new record in ArchivesSpace. Before we do a demo of any of these, I just wanted to point out that you can't, just import any old spreadsheet or any old XML file. So if you want access to the templates, the spreadsheet templates that ArchivesSpace supports, you can find those if you go to the ArchivesSpace homepage, archivespace.org, and then you go to using ArchivesSpace, and then there's this link for migration tools and data mapping. If I click that, and then I go all the way to the bottom here, there's a section for data imports and export maps. And so there are a couple of things you'll find here. You'll find both the mapping documents that explain how fields in your spreadsheet are going to map to different fields in ArchivesSpace. And you'll also find templates that you can download and use for importing. So if I wanted to import accessions from a CSV file, I can download this accession CSV template. This thing happens to live in GitHub, but if I sort of click on it and then I click this can be a little complicated just to figure out how to download these, but if I kind of click this raw file and I right click, I can save this. And if I opened it up, I'll save this to my desktop. If I actually open this up in Excel, I can see that this is just a plain old spreadsheet. Ignore, it has like 11 rows of kind of junk data in it, but the most important thing is that it has a series of column headers that kind of explain how to structure your accession data in this template in order to import it into ArchivesSpace. So if you wanted to use this, you could download this template, sort of wipe out all of the sample data, and then supply your own data here. Alternately, if you already had a spreadsheet of accession information in some way, you could sort of replace your existing column headers with the column headers that are supplied in this template as a way to batch import. So just know that, this on this archivespace.org homepage, this is where all of these import templates and mapping documents live. Just to show you an example of one of the mapping documents, this is the mapping kind of document for how MarkXML will import into ArchivesSpace. So if I were to kind of scroll down here, you can see, actually scroll up. You can see that, for every 100 and 600 and 700 field in a Mark file, this is how it's going to handle the various indicators. And kind of this is how it will respect the subfields in the Mark record and how those will map to various properties in ArchivesSpace. So that's kind of how these mapping documents are laid out. In most of them, there's also another tab that shows you how the data will export. So if you're exporting MarkXML from ArchivesSpace, this is how your ArchivesSpace data will map to Mark fields. In my experience, these mapping documents are mostly accurate. There are some cases where they just haven't been updated based on just a few small changes to the import and exports. You can see this one was last updated in 2013, so there might be a few things that are slightly different than are described in the mapping document. Okay. Let's go back to the page where we were here in my background jobs area, and let's actually do an import just to see how they work in the system. So what we're going to do, I'm going to import an EAD file. So I'm going to choose EAD as the format I want to import. And then before I do that, I'm just going to show you the file I'm going to import. So this is just a particular finding aid that exists in our collections at Duke. And I just wanted to show you like kind of what kind of data it has. It has some top level information. It's got 4 series here. And it's got, you know, a bunch of components under each series. And then it happens to have digital objects for a lot of these components. So what I did, you know, earlier this morning is I got that file as XML, as an EAD file. And then I'll show you if I click add file here, and then I just browse to where I saved that file, that XML file earlier, and I choose it. It's going to add that XML file to this little import queue here. This is useful because it is possible to upload more than one, to import more than one EAD file at the same time as part of the same import job. You could keep adding files, or you can actually drag and drop files into this box here. But once you have the files here that you want to import, you can click Start Job. And then what's going to happen, if I wait just a little bit, down here, it's going to start processing this import job. And you can kind of see a readout of what's happening in the background. So it's creating a bunch of agent records right now for people. It's creating subjects. And now it's creating archival object records for all of the components in that EAD file. And then depending on how large your EAD file is, this will sort of churn for a while. And then when it's finished, as long as it didn't encounter any errors, so assuming the EAD file was valid XML and also valid according to the EAD standard, you should get this little green success message here. The job is completed. If I click refresh page, down here below, it's going to show me sort of all of the different record types that it created as part of that import. And so you can see these little icons. This means it created an agent record for Julia Stockton Rush. It created some subject headings. And then if I click on any one of these, it's going to jump me over to the resource record. And so if I just scroll up here, you can see here's the resource record it created. It's got all of the top level information that I had in the EAD file. You can sort of see how all of the data mapped. You can see that it both created agents and linked them to the resource record all at the same time. Same with subjects. It imported all of my note fields. It even imported this kind of structured chronology list that I had in my EAD file. And then if I were to kind of drill down into the collection, you'll see it created all of these individual archival objects. It also created instances for each of the top containers and folders. It created, because these happen to have digital objects in the EAD file that are encoded with DAO tags, it also created digital objects, and at the same time linked those digital objects to my my archival objects. So if I click on this one component here and I scroll down to the instances section, you'll see that I have both a physical instance and then I have a digital object that it created at the same time. So this is just to show you that EAD imports can be really powerful. You can import a lot of different kinds of data in ArchivesSpace. It will create many record types as part of a single import job and then sort of link them all together. Let's see, anything else with imports? And just as a reminder, the the spreadsheet import that we saw last week is also another form of import, a way to import a bunch of archival objects into an existing collection record. That is not available from the background job area. If you remember, it's only available if you're in the context of a resource record using that load via spreadsheet button, but just know that that is another form of import that you can do. That was kind of a very whirlwind tour of imports. I think we're up against our break time, but if folks have questions in the Q&A, I'm happy to answer them during break.
Yep, sounds good. Yeah, it is time for break. We will go ahead and we'll take a break, and let's see, it's 1:18 now. So instead of coming back at 1:30, let's come back at 1:35 just to give everyone a chance to have a good break, and we'll try to catch up on the back end. There was a question in the chat asking if you could do a demo of importing a digital object spreadsheet. I don't know if we'll have time. We definitely don't have time right now, and maybe there'll be time at the end, but if there isn't, there is, I'm not sure if you're from a member institution, there is a user tutorial video in the Help Center of how to import digital objects via spreadsheet, via CSV. So I'll answer your question with a link to that. So if you are an ArchivesSpace member, you have access to that video. So let's go ahead and take a break now. So we're going to take a 16-minute break and come back at 35 minutes after the hour. Thanks. All right, it's 35 minutes after the hour, so we're going to go ahead and get started again with the final hour of our time together. While we were on break, Noah and I both dropped some links to some resources in the chat. These are really good follow-up resources after we finish this workshop. So be sure to check those out for importing and exporting and general data cleanup stuff. And then Noah did answer some questions, or a question in the Q&A by typing a response. So be sure to check that out too. So we're all caught up on the chat, and there's good stuff. We're all caught up on the Q&A, and there's good stuff in the chat. And we're going to go ahead and finish out our time together talking about exports, reports, and data cleanup. Noah, are you ready?
Yep, I'm ready.
Do it.
All right, let me share my screen again. Okay. Yeah, so let's look quickly at exports, how to export data from ArchivesSpace. Just like with imports, there are a number of different types of exports available in ArchivesSpace. That's one of the really nice things about it, is it supports import and export of a lot of common library metadata standards. With exports though, the way you actually access the exports is, rather than going to background jobs, you navigate to whatever record it is that you want to export. So for example, let's look first at resource records. So if I click browse and I go to resources, I can select any of these resources. Let's look at the Krispy Kreme records, and I can either pull this up in view mode or edit mode, and I'll still have access to the export functionality. So if I'm looking at a resource record, you'll see down here there are a number of different buttons, but one of these is export. And if I click that, here you can see, with resource records at least, all of the different export types that are available for resource records. And so we've got download EAD, we can download Mark XML, we can download container labels or generate a PDF. Let's kind of break down some of these quickly and like talk about what you're going to get, and some of the other options available in each type. So with download EAD, you have some additional options about whether or not you want to include unpublished nodes or unpublished, so any components or notes that you may have left that published checkbox unchecked. If you still want to include those in your EAD, you would want to check this box, include unpublished. If you don't, just toggle this off. If you happen to have digital objects linked to your resource record or to your archival object records, and you want those digital objects, you want that information to be exported in DAO tags in EAD, you'll want to check this box. If you don't, uncheck it. This option is a little, whoops. This option here for use numbered C tags. What this is referring to is just in the EAD standard, there are a couple of different ways that you can choose to model your components. You can either use numbered components. So if you're familiar with EAD, that looks something like C01, and then a child of that would be C02, C03, etc. EAD as a standard also lets you just use generic C components and just nest them under each other without the numbers. So typically, like your shop might implement like either numbered or unnumbered components. So you just want to choose the option that works best for you. And then finally, there is an option to export EAD as EAD3. So EAD3 is just the most recent version of the standard. By default, if you don't check this, it's going to export EAD 2002, which is a previous version of the standard. I will say that if you export EAD3, it's going to export a valid EAD3 document that's perfectly fine. It doesn't quite take advantage of the full expressiveness that's possible in EAD3. So just know that it's kind of like a simplified version of EAD3 that you're going to get when you export EAD3. Those are all the options for download EAD. If I click download EAD here, what it's going to do is just churn for a little bit, and then it's going to ask me where to save that EAD file, and I can just click save, and then it'll download. Similarly, you can download MarkXML. You have the same unpublished published checkbox option. You can download container labels. This is a little bit of a misnomer. What's gonna happen if you click download container labels is you're actually just gonna get a spreadsheet of all of the top containers that exist in this resource record. And then if you wanted to develop some sort of like mail merge Excel label printing system in your shop, you could do that based on this container Excel export. So it's not actually going to like print labels for you just by clicking the button. You'd have to do some additional work to make that possible. And then finally, you can generate a PDF. I'll show you what this looks like. This will actually kick you over to a background job. And then what it's actually doing in the background is it's exporting EAD, and then it's converting the EAD to a PDF. And so it takes a little while to churn. But when it's finished, if I click refresh page, it's going to give me this link here that I can click to download my PDF. And if I just save this somewhere and open it up, you'll see that ArchivesSpace just sort of supplies this generic style sheet. So it's pretty nice, to be honest. You've got your kind of table of contents for all your different sections of the record, summary information, biographical information. All the data that's in your resource record is kind of dumped into this PDF, and then you can see here's what sort of container lists will look like in the PDF format. So again, a really nice way to quickly generate PDFs. It also kind of exports table of contents information, which is nice. So that is all of the exports available for resource records. Some additional exports, if we go to agents and we look at any one of these given agents, for agents, you only have one export option. You can download an EAC CPF XML file for agents. And this is just an encoding standard for archival context, corporate bodies and persons and families. If you're familiar with it, you'll be familiar with what this EAC CPF file would look like. Let's see, what else? Digital objects. If I browse and look at any given digital object, there's an export option available for digital objects. There are 3 different ways you can export digital object information. You can download mods, METs, or Dublin Core. Mods is just sort of a Library of Congress standard for an XML standard for digital object metadata. Within the METs download option, you actually have kind of 2 sub options. METs is often referred to as like a wrapper standard. So you can download a METs file and then choose within that METs file if you want your descriptive metadata expressed as mods or expressed as Dublin Core inside of that METs file. And METs will also include information about how your various file versions relate to the object. And it kind of includes that structural information in ways that the mods and Dublin Core options do not. Dublin Core is just going to download a pretty pared down XML Dublin Core record that will include, I think, only the kind of top level information. It's not going to include any complex digital object information if you have complex digital objects. Again, just as a reminder, if you want to know how the fields are going to map to all of these different standards, all of that information is available in that mapping section that I pointed out earlier on the ArchivesSpace.org homepage. So if you plan on using these exports, definitely check that out. It is possible to customize some of these exports. That is not something that you can do directly in the staff interface, but if you have sort of support from developers in your institution, or if you're comfortable sort of working under the hood in ArchivesSpace, there are ways to write plugins or otherwise modify things like that PDF style sheet, or to change the EAD mappings if that's something that you want to do. And there are a lot of examples of other institutions that have done that. If you like search GitHub and ArchivesSpace, you'll find code from other institutions about how they've modified their exports to support some particular use case that they have. Another form of export available in ArchivesSpace is really reports. And so I'll show you just a few, or show you how reports work in ArchivesSpace. So if you go to the create dropdown and then you choose background job again, there's another option for create report. And if I click that, what I'm going to get is a sort of list of default reports that come, shipped with ArchivesSpace. So these are sort of generic reports that'll give you different sorts of information. So there are a lot of reports based around accession information. So if I want to see kind of a really simple list of all of my accession records, I can export that. We'll go ahead and do one here real quickly. There's a resource list report. If I want a really simple spreadsheet of all of my resource records, I can click select. And then within these reports, you have a number of different formats you can export that report in. Typically, I like to get them as CSV, but if you would rather have like a more human readable sort of printable PDF, that's an option too. But if I choose CSV, I'll just show you kind of how this works. It'll create a background job. And like we've seen before, it'll kind of give you information in this log about what it's doing. When it finishes, you get this green message here. If you refresh the page, then you can download the report that it generated in this files area if you click download report. So if I download this and I open it up, fingers crossed, yeah, I'm just going to see a list of some of the resource records in my repository. I was playing with this earlier, and I'm actually not sure why a lot of these, it's giving me multiple rows for some of my resources, but I think this has to do with some of these resources having more than one extent statement or more than one date statement. So this is just to point out, like, some of these reports, some of these canned reports are a little, I wouldn't call them buggy, but they're just, sometimes they're not exactly what you would expect. And so you might want to just kind of play around with them and see, see what you get. Just like almost anything in ArchivesSpace, it's possible to write your own custom reports. That's not something that we can really cover in the workshop, and it's not something that you can do in the staff interface. But if you're comfortable like writing SQL queries, you can sort of package a custom report as a plugin in ArchivesSpace, and then I can just I'll show you just really quickly. I'm popped over here to my Duke version of ArchivesSpace, and if I go to our report area, you can see I've added all of these like custom reports that are very specific to needs that we have around like annual reporting and quarterly reporting in the Rubenstein library where I work. And so this is something that you can do, you know, if you have some sort of expertise, developer expertise on staff, you can write custom reports and then make them available in the staff interface so that anyone could run them. I think that that's all I had with exports and reports. Before we move on to data cleanup and customization. So we've had a lot of questions about data cleanup, I think, in the workshop, which is natural. You're going to get messy data in your ArchivesSpace instance. It's a fact of life. Data is just messy. People are messy. They, you know, create duplicate records. They create duplicate agent records or subject headings. They misspell things. So fortunately, there are a lot of ways in ArchivesSpace to sort of clean up data. We can't show you all of those, but we can show you some of the more common ways to clean up data in ArchivesSpace. So one of the, and we've looked at this a little bit already, but one of the areas where you will get messy data is often in your drop-down lists in the application, so your controlled value lists. So we can kind of see what this looks like. If I want to kind of clean up those drop-down lists, what I can do is go to the system drop-down and then go to manage controlled value lists. And then all of the drop-down lists in the system are available to you here, assuming you have proper permissions to access this area. So some of the really common lists that kind of get corrupted or, or messy are the list of container types and the list of extent types. This happens especially when you're importing data, especially if you're importing data from EAD. It's going to take any sort of extent value that's in your EAD file, and it's going to create, if that doesn't yet exist in ArchivesSpace, it's going to create a new extent type when it imports it. So if we look at the extent type vocabulary list, for example, and we look at some of these values in here, we've got cubic feet, we've got linear feet. And if I look here, I've got linear feet in all caps without the underscore. I've got linear feet. Actually, I've only got it twice, which is pretty good. I've got two different ways that gigabytes appears in the system. So what you're going to what this means is that anytime somebody's entering an extent value in ArchivesSpace and they use the dropdown, they're going to see two different options for gigabytes. And this is obviously not ideal. So one of the things that you can do is if you access the controlled value list here, you can merge controlled values together and kind of eliminate the one that you don't want. And so the way you do that, see if I remember this, is you go to the one that you don't want to keep. So the victim, I guess, and you choose merge. And then it's going to ask you, what value do you want to merge this value into? And so if I go down and find gigabytes and I click merge, now what it's done is it's merged those 2 gigabyte values together into the single one, and any record, any extent statement that exists anywhere in ArchivesSpace that use the old version of gigabytes is now like linked to this single version of gigabytes. So it merges the values, but also sort of resolves all of those links throughout your system. So that can be really handy. While we're looking at this controlled value lists, some other things that you can do in controlled value lists is you can suppress certain values. So say there were values in this list that I wanted to retain in the system, but I just didn't want to make them available to people who are entering data. I can click the suppress button, and then that would mean that that option would no longer show up in the drop-down list for staff or students or whoever entering data. You can also delete values from this list. Just keep in mind, if you ArchivesSpace kind of has a fail-safe where it is not going to let me delete a controlled value if that value is actively used in the system. So over here in this column, we can see for this poster in example, we can see that there's one related item that has this value in it. So if I try to click delete, it's going to tell me unable to delete value because it's currently being referenced by a record. So if you want to clean them up, you can either merge this into something else, or you can click this and kind of go find the offending record, and you can update the value there. And then once you've kind of moved that link to another value, you can then delete this this value from the value list. Other things you can do in these value lists, you can, if you want to set the order that the values appear in the dropdowns, you can kind of move these values around. So let's say we always wanted linear feet to be the first option in our extent type dropdown. What we could do is click this up arrow and kind of keep moving this extent value of linear feet up to the top so that it shows up at the beginning of dropdown lists. It can be kind of time consuming, admittedly, to move all these things around how you want, but this is how you do it in the staff interface. So that's value lists. Again, if we look at the container type value list, it looks almost identical to this, and we can see we've got different container types here. Many of you have probably run into the Fodler problem. I call this the Fodler problem, where people have misspelled various container types. So again, if we want to merge Fodler into folder, we can do that. Pretty straightforward. This is a this is a list that I just like every couple of months, I will drop in here and merge values in our system that have kind of proliferated over time. Let's see, other things you can do for data cleanup. Nancy pointed at this a little bit earlier, but there's some functionality around editing containers. One of the things that will often happen is you will get, especially if you're doing imports and then you're deleting and importing again, you will, if we remember, if we delete an archival object or a collection that has containers in it, we're not actually deleting those container records. And so sometimes you'll end up with what are called unassociated containers. So these are sort of containers that exist in your system that aren't linked to anything. Luckily, and at least in this workshop instance, we don't have any unassociated containers, but if you did, you can search for them and then you can delete them in a batch. I'm guessing if I go to my Duke instance and I look for unassociated containers, we're probably going to have a bunch of them. Yeah, we have 225. So this is something I do periodically, is just go in here and delete all of the unassociated containers. Let's see, a few other things you can do for cleaning up data. This is a little bit more of a experimental feature, but there is, if I go to create and background jobs, you'll see this batch find and replace option that is marked beta. This has been marked beta for probably 6 or 7 years. I would, if you're going to use this, I would highly advise you to be like very careful with it. But I have found this to be useful in very select situations where I want to, for example, change like a misspelling of a name that might appear in a title field across a bunch of components in a particular collection. So what this feature lets you do is it lets you kind of find the base record that you want to edit. So if I say I know all these edits I want to make are in the Krispy Kreme record, and I know that I really want to edit resource components, and I want to edit something in the title field, then I could do something like say I really have an aversion to this spelling of donut and I want to make it donut instead. I can like create a batch job to find and replace that term with another term. Again, I would caution you about using this. And if you have access to a test instance, I think this is something that's really useful to test out before you run it in a live production situation. So it looks like there weren't any matches for that, so it didn't actually change anything. But if it were to have changed records, you would get kind of a report of all of the records it changed right here. There's no undo for this feature, so again, be real careful with it. But it can be useful in like select situations. Let's see. There are, I think I showed most of the ways you can clean data in the staff interface itself. There's sort of a whole array of things that you can do, edits you can make in batch if you are comfortable working with the ArchivesSpace API. This is not something we cover in the workshop. There have been workshops devoted to using the ArchivesSpace API. So if that's something of interest to you, definitely check that out. There's a lot of documentation and sort of blog posts out there in the community about how you can do that. And essentially what you're doing is you're sort of writing a script that will, find a bunch of records, open them up and edit them in some way and resave them in ArchivesSpace. but it requires, you to use some sort of programming language to access the back end of ArchivesSpace. But that's one of the really powerful things about ArchivesSpace, is that it kind of supports that level of interaction, and it has that open API. It's something we do all the time when we're editing things in batch. All right, the last thing we're going to cover is, and I think really useful, is how you can kind of customize your ArchivesSpace instance. So there are a lot of ways you can customize ArchivesSpace. Some of those you can do in the staff interface, and some of them you can do, under the hood if you have access to the application files. What we're going to talk about in the workshop are the specific customizations you can make directly in the staff interface. And so one of the things you can do, and we saw this a little bit last week, somebody had a question about this, is if you go to this preferences area up here, if you find your username, admin, and then you drop down, you'll see that there are 3 different preference settings in ArchivesSpace. There's global, repository, and user preferences. So if I click on any of these, I'm going to get the same set of preferences that I can edit, but just know that if I set global preferences, those global preferences would be overridden by repository preferences. And then likewise, preferences set at the user level would override anything at the repository level or global level. So there's sort of an order of precedence that ArchivesSpace respects when you're editing preferences. Typically, we at least just set our preferences at the repository level. We don't really allow users to set their own preferences, but I'll go ahead and click repository preferences, and we'll see some of the things that you can do here. So in this preferences area, you have some general settings up here. You can choose whether or not you want users to be able to see records that are marked as suppressed. So you can toggle that on and off. You have this publish option. What this means here, if I check publish here, what this means is that any new record I create in ArchivesSpace will automatically have the publish checkbox checked. So you're able to set that as kind of a repository level preference, so that you don't have to check all those boxes, every time you want to publish. If you know that you just want everything published by default, you might think carefully about whether or not you want to do this, especially if you're using the public interface, because records would become immediately available, in the public interface if this was checked and you did not uncheck it in records that you wanted to not publish. This option to pre-populate records, I'm going to go ahead and check this. This has a very specific meaning too. When we set up templates or constant data for different record types, this indicates that we actually want those templates to be invoked whenever we create a new record, and we'll see how that works in just a second. But I'm just going to toggle this on, and then finally up here, you have the ability to sort of choose a default language. This would just mean that whenever there is a language of description field available in ArchivesSpace, it will just have English pre-populated as the default value. All right, some other things you can do. Here you'll see a big long list of all of the note fields that are available in resource records or in archival object records. If there's a particular order of note fields that you prefer in your institution, you're able to kind of drag these around and set your own order. So let's say I want the abstract, and then the biographical note, and then the scope content note to always be like the first 3 notes that show up. that show up in the staff interface when I'm editing records. I can do that. This is nice if you have like an internal processing manual and your manual is arranged in like a particular order and like instructing folks how to enter different notes. It might be nice to set your note order in ArchivesSpace to correspond with whatever your internal documentation looks like, just so people can kind of see notes in the same order in both systems. If I keep scrolling down in this preferences area, what you have from kind of here until the very end is a list of all the different browse screens. So you have a session browse columns, agent browse columns, etc. And I think we saw this last week, but what you're able to do here is if you want the results in a browse screen to be, the columns in a browse screen to be arranged in a particular order, you can set that order here. So let's say, for example, with the session records, we want the identifier field to be the first column and the title to be the second column. We can make those changes here. We can also set a preference for how we want the columns to sort, like whether we want it to just sort by the title by default or maybe by identifier. So we made those changes here for accession records. I could make the same changes for any of these other browse screens. So for agents, archival objects, assessments, et cetera, et cetera. So any of the browse screens, I'm able to configure this way. There is an additional area for search columns. So this would apply to search results that include all record types. So if we remember right, if I just do a default search in ArchivesSpace here from this search box, it's going to return all different record types. And if I want to control the order that the columns show up in those search results, I can do that right here. So I could, I don't know, I could add something like audit information to those search results if I want. So after you've made all these changes in your preferences, you have to save them. I click Save Preferences here. And then we can kind of go in and see what happened. If we go to Browse the Sessions, we'll see that it moved our identifier column to the first column. What are the other preferences we set? We set an order for note fields. So if I open up this resource record and I go down to the note area and I sort of open up all these note fields, if a record already exists in the system before you set your preferences, it won't rearrange them automatically, but there is this button up here that says apply standard note order. And if I click that, it's going to rearrange the note fields in the order that I have them set in the preferences area. So that's kind of a handy thing you can do. Let's see. One of the last things to show you, and this can be really powerful customization that you can make, is you are able to create default templates for almost all of the record types. So for example, if I go to Browse Resources and I click Edit Default Values, I can create a template for new resource records or for new resource component records. So let's go ahead and choose resource, and I'll sort of show you what this looks like. So what I'm doing here, it looks just like a new resource record, but what I'm actually doing is I'm editing a template that I can reuse over and over again in the application. So if I want all new top-level resource records to have the level of description of collection, I can set that to collection. Let's say I have some, prefix that I use for all resource record identifiers. MSS, for example. I can kind of set that. I could set a default language if I wanted to English. This would be the language of the materials, not the language of the description. I could set a default date type if I know I'm always going to have inclusive dates, or most often I'm going to have inclusive dates. I can kind of set that. Let's say I always want to record in linear feet. Let's see, just to show you another thing that can be really useful. You can set, you can provide kind of boilerplate text in any note field that you want. And so you might have something like, maybe you apply the same access restriction note to everything that just says like, collection is open for research. And this is what you're going to use like 90% of the time. I can set this in the template. I could also do something like set a default, provide some boilerplate text for a preferred citation. So you could say like, you know, you could say like collection title, Rubenstein Library, Duke University. So again, you can provide pretty much any data in any field you want in these templates. And then if I save it, it says save resource here, but what I'm actually doing is saving the template. And so now when I go to create a new resource record, when I do that, it has all of the data that I supplied in that template is already pre-filled in this new resource record. So I've got this level of description dropdown is already set. My language information is there, dates, et cetera, et cetera. And if I go down to the note fields, you can see it's supplied this boilerplate note text. So this can be a huge time saver if you end up having a lot of consistent language or boilerplate language in note fields in every resource record. Similarly, you can set defaults for resource components. So these would be like lower level archival objects. You can do exactly the same thing I just showed for the lower levels too, and save that template. And then anytime you go to create a child or create a sibling in the context of a resource record, it will apply these templates. And most of the other record types have the same option for setting those default values. And the way you access it again is if you go to browse, you find the record type, like locations, for example, you'll always see this edit default values button where you can edit the templates. And the final thing to point out with that though, is if we go back to our repository preferences, and this trips a lot of people up, if we want those default values actually applied to new records, we always have to make sure that this pre-populate records checkbox is checked. Otherwise, it won't respect the data in those templates. It'll ignore it. So if we want the data to show up from the template in new records, we have to have this checked in the preferences. Let's see, anything else? I think that is about all I wanted to show. If there are specific questions about other kinds of customizations that you can make, please ask them. Again, there's a ton of stuff you can do under the hood if you are able to write plugins and that sort of thing, or even borrow plugins from other institutions. There's sort of an infinite number of ways that you can customize ArchivesSpace, and we're only able really to show things that are possible directly in the staff interface in the workshop. But I think that's all.
Thanks, Noah. All right, we did have some stuff popping up in the Q&A. Someone asked specifically related to creating container list. If you use mail merge to create your container and folder labels, if you have a template you would be willing to share, Veronica has asked that you reach out to her via the chat. So if you would be willing to share that with her, please do. Someone asked, and Noah, you can answer this question, but someone asked Noah if you had your custom reports available anywhere on GitHub. So I'll let you answer that. But I responded by putting a link to the awesome ArchivesSpace GitHub into the chat. That's a community generated resource list. So there are community generated reports there, as well as plugins. Noah just mentioned plugins. So things that the community has created. And Noah, you can answer whether or not Dukes is available.
Yeah, the custom reports are available in GitHub. Here's the link to them that I can put in the chat, but I'm showing them on the screen now. I've lost the chat. Here we go. Yeah, I tried to kind of bundle these up in a GitHub repository. And again, these are very specific to us, like our reporting needs and the way our data is structured. But this is a single plugin, ArchivesSpace plugin, that would create all of these different reports that I showed you. And, you know, I don't want to get too far in the weeds here, but you can kind of see the code for all of these plugins, or for all of these different queries that generate these reports here. And other institutions have done very similar things. So if you're kind of casting about in GitHub and looking for custom reports, you might be able to find them. Yep.
Thanks, Noah. Noah, do you link that to your GitHub repository from Awesome ArchivesSpace?
I don't know if I did or not. I can.
Okay, that's your homework.
Yeah.
The workshop. All right, we have a question in the chat. Is it possible to change what information appears above the collapsible additional description section?
Is it possible that, where is the additional description section? I'm not sure exactly where that is, or what that's referring to.
Okay. Above in the PUI. So what?
Oh,
yeah.
Yeah, let's, so if I go to the public interface, I think what she's asking is, like, can you configure which fields you want to display sort of like above the fold in the public interface so that they're not kind of buried in these collapsible sections? That's a very good question. I will say that yes, it's possible. I don't know how easy it is to make that change. If that's like a configuration setting that you can modify easily in the config file, and there was a workshop or a tutorial on that, I believe. Or if that's something that you'd really have to do some like serious coding to fix. But yeah, I honestly am not sure how complicated that would be.
I think the answer is complicated.
Yeah.
The workshop that you're referencing on config files, it's Know Thy Config file. It's a workshop series that Valerie Adonisio at Atlas Systems is doing. I'll find that in just a second. That's but it's on the Atlas Systems website, not ArchivesSpace. So if you're trying to find that in the future, that's Atlas Systems, but it's a great series, and Valerie goes through and shows you sort of like what's possible within the config file and how to customize ArchivesSpace a little bit more than what we just showed you in the staff user interface. So I'll find that in just a second. And then Katie asked in the chat, so when you apply default values, that only applies to new records, not previously created records, right?
That's correct. Yep.
All right, and then I know that Dean had some questions in the Q&A, but it sounds like Nancy was helping him directly, so I don't know if we need to read those out loud. And I don't see any other questions in the chat. I'm trying to find that recording. So if anyone has any questions, please feel free to pop those into the chat now. Here it is. Right, so I'm going to drop into the chat a link to that Atlas Systems webinar. It's actually their webpage with all of their webinars from last year, but it includes 2 webinars related to the config file that are really useful. I definitely recommend reviewing those. All right, I'm not seeing anything else coming up in the chat or Q&A. I'm speaking very slowly to allow for time. Anything else from our trainers, Nancy and Noah? You did a lot of talking over the past 2 weeks. So if there's nothing left to say, that's perfectly fine. But if there's anything you wanted to mention before we conclude, please feel free.
I thought I would reward everyone with this virtual donut since they made it to the end of the workshop. So you can just gaze upon this beauty from the Smithsonian.
Thank you, Noah. That's great. That's my favorite type of donut, is one that I can't eat. Awesome. That's great. We do have,
Go ahead.
we have some questions popping up in the Q&A, but Nancy, if there's anything you want to add, please go ahead.
Oh, my only thing was going to be to remember to fill out the evaluation afterwards, because as I think Jessica said, this is the first time we've tried doing basically replicating what we would do in person with exercises and the full workbook in this virtual mode. So if there are ways that we could improve that, it would be helpful to know.
Yeah, for sure. Please do fill that out. Jenny asks in the Q&A, are there any resources that would aid an institution that's implementing ArchivesSpace from scratch, as in not migrating from another system? Sometimes that is easier, Jenny. On your agenda, and I'll drop it into the chat now, but on your agenda, there is a link to our Getting Started webpage. That is a great place to start. It has different demos and things that might help, but it also has recordings of additional workshops and things like that. And there is another a webinar that I'll find, not a webinar, a presentation that I'll find from our online forum a couple years ago. It's called We're on the Road to Somewhere, and it's about prepping for your implementation. So I'll find those 2 resources and drop those into the chat now. And then Dean says, I have a question on subjects. My subjects display like biographies, hold on, sorry. Biographies, the Funniac Spring, subject, source, art, and architecture thesaurus. What I mean is not only the subject, but also the source appears to me and to user instead of only subject.
Yeah, I don't know exactly what would be going on there. I mean, I'm assuming what he's saying is that in his public interface, like what we're seeing here, like if we're looking at subjects, that he's also seeing the source information. Yeah, I don't know why that would be the case unless that information is actually stored in, it's all crammed in the same term field that displays rather than in the, source field where it sort of naturally should be. It's hard to say what's going on without actually seeing the data, but yeah.
Yeah, is it showing up in the PUI or in the style sheet? And then is the style sheet coded to actually display the source? Maybe that's why. But yeah, if it's not all crammed in the actual field, it's got to be dumping out based on something.
He says the subject's in the resource record, not on the subject screen. So if we go into a resource record, yeah, I don't know. I'm not seeing the source information here. My guess is that if that's happening, the data is probably in, like it's in the term field and not in the source field. Yeah, tell him to you know, email me a screenshot of it.
Yeah,
I
Dean,
wonder
if you'd like, maybe,
it's been tweaked and accidentally the source was told to display. But yeah, no, it's not something I've typically seen happen.
Yeah.
yeah, Dean, I would recommend maybe taking a screenshot like Noah said and posting it to the listserv, and which Noah and Nancy are on for sure, but there are other users who may be able to help with that, and Mike can see what's going on there. I'm getting a lot of different messages asking if there are resources related to like certain topics. So what I'm going to do, instead of trying to find specific YouTube videos, I'm just going to put a link to our YouTube channel. And there are, like I said, there are a couple different workshops related to prepping your implementation, about different types of workflows, about using different tools. So please go to our YouTube channel and you can search there. All right. I think, yeah. And Dean, if you do use a hosting provider, definitely check out with your hosting provider to see what's going on there. I think that's it. I think we are all caught up on questions. Again, make sure you please do fill out the workshop evaluation. And thank you everyone who is still here for hanging with us for 4 whole days. It was a lot of information in a short period of time. And thank you to Nancy and Noah for being willing to do this. This was awesome. It was our first time trying it, and I think it went really well. And I appreciate all of you attending, and I will see you at the next ArchivesSpace event. Bye, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.